Welcome everyone to the fifth episode in our series exploring field gemology with GIA that we've been hosting now for 4 episodes. So it's the fifth and final one. And thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to be joined by our guest. And we've learned so much with Vertriest since the beginning of this series. He is the field gemology manager of the GIA office in Bangkok. And I'm going to invite him now to join us. If you haven't watched the previous episodes, they're all available on this channel in the Reels section. They're also available on the Rapaport Jewelry Pro YouTube channel. So I really encourage you and invite you to check. We've discussed so many topics of field gemology, and I hope you'll be able to catch up on. So welcome back, the fifth episode and final episode of this series, which we've learned so much. We've learned about places, people, culture, tools. Really, as I said, I encourage you to catch up with the previous episodes. The whole series was brought to you by GIA, Gemological Institute of America, which has been protecting consumers and supporting the global gem and jewelry trade since 1931 through research, education, and laboratory services. So really, thank you so much, Wim, for having been such a wonderful guest. We've learned so much with you. And today we are going to learn about the sources of gems, which is not the same as gem sourcing. So can we just clarify that in case of people coming to this live for gem sourcing? This is not what we're going to cover today, but we have a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a very important misconception that I think when we started the first session, I think we broke down field gemology in 5 parts, where I think the first part we discussed, I believe, was the mining, where I think it's important for everyone to understand more of what the implications of mining your gemstones are, but also the implications of the geological formation of your gemstones. And I think we talked about the actual gemstones themselves, understanding your gemstones, the impact. I think we had a lot of discussion on treatment of gemstones and what it really means and how important it really is and how critical for the entire supply chain. And I think we also talked about understanding the trading. How do gems get from point A to point B to point C? How does a stone come out of the ground in Pakistan or in East Africa or in Thailand or in Brazil and end up in a piece of jewelry in Paris? Because there's a lot of things we know about the jewelry manufacturing process, but what happens before a gemstone is cut, there's a lot of obscurity about it, and there's a lot of very interesting things happening there. So I think we have talked a lot about that, and I think the last pillar of those 4, so we had the trading, we had the mining, we had the actual gems, is the actual source of the people, a source of the gemstones. So the source of the gemstones is really trying to understand the place where your gemstones come from. Gems come from a whole different places, and they all have different meanings in the place where they come from. Like understanding the culture that is around it. And in some places, that culture related to gemstones goes back thousands of years. In other places, these cultures are very, very new because these gemstones are newly discovered. That doesn't mean they're inferior. They're just in a different stage of development. So there might be less cultural attachment to a gemstone, but also it might have a very different impact on the local economy of those places. So understanding the economy of these places, understanding the political situation wherever these stones come from, that is also a very important part of the story if you are trying to understand the full story of your gemstone. Because there are a lot of complexities in the gem trade that a lot of gem traders prefer not to talk about it. Because a lot of places, it's not all beautiful stories that happen at the source. There is a wealth of beautiful stories, but very often the perception can be a little bit not super positive. But it is important that we try and look for all the beautiful things that happen there. And also, if there are things that are happening there that we are not really proud of, that we should know about that we should understand that, because that is the only way that we can talk about it. If we don't understand it, if we don't know about it, we're never going to talk about it. And if we're not able to talk about it, we're never going to be able to address it and help to improve it if these are situations that can be improved. So that's why it's very important as a field gemologist, but also as a gemologist in general, to understand the sources of your gem, understand where your gem comes from and what it means in the place it comes from, and what the impact is that it has locally. Because let's make that clear. Most gemstone miners aren't in the business of finding gemstones for beautiful jewelry. They are not mining it so people in Paris and in Hong Kong and in New York can wear the most exquisite jewelry. These people are in the business of actually scraping together a living, making some money there. And if they can make money with gemstone mining, that is great for them. But if they make more money with gold mining, they'll switch to gold mining. If there is more money in farming, they'll make more money with farming. They don't do this because they would love to see more beautiful jewelry on the red carpets of New York. So there's a lot of different motives, a lot of different incentives, a lot of different drivers that happen at the source that are very important to understand as a gemologist.
Absolutely. And I just want to remind people who are joining us now, thanks for joining us. We're very lucky to have Vertriest from the GIA, manager of field gemology in Bangkok, but here today from Carlsbad, the mother-in-law of the GIA in California. And please, please, please ask your questions. That is such an amazing opportunity we have to learn, to find out more about gemstones. Especially today, we really want to focus on the sources of gemstones, and to have him with us is a real privilege. So please put your questions either in the chat or in the question box so we can follow up with you. And if you want to tell us as well in the chat where you're coming from, that would be great. So we have an idea of who's joining us today, if you are in the trade, also which part of the trade are you from. That would be really interesting for us to know. So hopefully we can really answer your questions. And to start with something a bit fancy, we talked in a previous episode of the big Indian wedding, the Ambani wedding, that had a lot of amazing, amazing gemstones. Hi, we have Stefania from London, wonderful. So please tell us in the chat.
From India, from the UK, that's super cool.
Fantastic. We have students of gemology, wonderful.
People from Australia are still awake. That's pretty impressive.
Going to hopefully justify that you're still up with us. Hi from Istanbul, wonderful. Qatar, wow, we really, Canada, fantastic.
Yeah, I think you brought up the Ambani wedding. I think the Ambani wedding is...
Sorry, Vim. Yeah. You can ask a question if it's about the sources of gems, and if it's relevant to a field gemologist as Vim, please, please, please ask your question. This is your chance. This is what we want this session to be, as interactive and educational as possible. I can ask questions to Vim until tomorrow, but and it's a wonderful guest, so please just enjoy this session and ask your questions. So let's talk about this wedding. And I saw a lot of green, I saw a lot of diamonds, I saw a lot of beautiful reds, but there was one color that kind of didn't seem to appear.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a very interesting, similar thing to field gemology, but we're doing this in a very unfieldy environment. Because, when people think about field gemology, they think about going to all these rough places and understanding what is going on so very far away in the bush in Africa or high up in the Himalayas, things like that. So the Ambani wedding doesn't really seem like a place where field gemology is relevant, because it's all glamour and glitter and probably one of the fanciest events of the last decades. But there is a very interesting field gemology related question that comes down to, we need to understand the source. We need to understand the roots of where all of this is coming from. Because this was an Indian wedding where two Indian people got married in a very Indian environment. So like you said, we've seen a lot of stones there, and we've seen some of the most incredible Indian inspired jewelry. But if we think about colored stones, people come up with, if you ask people to name 3 colored stones or 3 colors that you would like to see most in colored stones, people are going to come up with red. And yes, we've seen a lot of rubies at the wedding. We've seen a lot of rubellite as well, so the red variety of tourmaline, and some of the most exquisite, usually carved materials. Very, very nice. Then we have green color as well. Obviously, emerald has a very strong link with the whole Indian culture. There's a lot of Mughal jewelry inspired from all the Muslim traditions, where green is a very important color. A lot of these carvings, a lot of these jewelry. So that all makes sense there as well, that's included there. But then the third color, and probably I name it now the third color, but usually a lot of people name it as the first color, is actually going to be blue. And I looked at it, and I only saw 1 or 2 pieces of jewelry, and there were a lot of pieces of jewelry there that were worth looking at, that actually included blue gemstones and blue sapphires. So if you understand, if you look more into the Indian culture, how they use gemstones, and understand how at the source the perception of that gemstones, the culture of that gemstones is working, you actually understand why there is so little blue gemstones present there. Because the blue gemstone, and I forget the name of the deity it's associated with, it is an extremely powerful gemstone in Indian culture. So there's a lot of gemstones being worn for their beneficial properties, where they actually line up with some traits or with some people that are born in certain environments. Exactly. Like I think somebody says here the planet Saturn. So the blue color is related to the planet Saturn, which is a very powerful gemstone that actually not a lot of people are able to handle that power in Indian culture. So that just explains why we actually saw an absence of blue colored jewelry at that Indian wedding. I think a lot of people are commenting here. There's a lot of people tuned in from India that just are teaching me so much more about this. Like somebody here mentioned that in Indian belief that like the fact that the Titanic sank is because there was a big blue jewel on board. So blue jewelry is extremely powerful and is really a force to be reckoned with, and a force that can be extremely destructive. And destructive and a beautiful wedding, those are not exactly things that go hand in hand. So it would make sense that people shy away from blue jewelry there. Even when you go to India, and where there is a huge culture on wearing jewelry, there's not a lot of blue gemstones being worn there. It is mostly greens and reds, and then obviously a lot of diamonds as well. But if you understand what the relevance of blue gemstones is in colored gemstones, you look at that whole Ambani wedding with kind of different eyes. If you know what emeralds mean in Indian culture, if you know what these red gemstones mean in Indian culture, if you know the relevance of diamonds in Indian culture, that would just give you way more appreciation for everything that we've seen there. And I think it's a very polished and very clean environment where we can apply that principle. But a lot of these same principles apply to the source, where a lot of these gemstones have value for these people in ways that you might not realize, or these gemstones impact people's lives in ways that you don't realize, because a lot of these things seem foreign. It's a big, big world out there, and a lot of us are pretty stuck in our own little corner. So if you try to understand the source, it just means like we try to understand what it means for other people that maybe have a different background. If you want to get goosebumps the next time you look at a ruby, talk to a Burmese person first. Because the way that these people talk about rubies, the way that it is almost ingrained in their DNA, that will just elevate your appreciation for rubies so much more, just because you catch a glimpse of a culture that has been related to rubies, that has been working with rubies, that has been treasuring rubies for over 1,000 years. That just opens your mind completely to all these things.
I think that's what has been so interesting in this series, that we've really looked at the full picture, which is the culture, the people, the historical connection. And I think you mentioned something about not being narrow-minded, but a bit closed off on certain things because people don't have the full picture most of the time. And we were talking about, for example, I've just researched an article about Paraiba tourmalines. Yeah. And Paraiba talking about a neon blue color, an exciting color, a stone that suddenly we talk about much more because it's been published quite a lot about. We've been talking about it quite a lot. And there was something very interesting. Brazil, everyone wants the Brazilian ones. Now the small stones supplies are going down. And then you have Mozambique, which is considered as another place to get your Paraiba from, but not as good officially yet, even if the stones are superb and the sizes are really big. And then during my research, I found out there's also stones from Nigeria, but nobody wants them. And we were talking about it and we said, it's just the name. It's the name, the imagination, the lack of knowledge of a source. So I would love to know your point of view, how also maybe to help actually the trade, retailers, designers to explain to their clients, because once they know, it's a completely different story.
Yeah. So I think that whole Paraiba source story, because we have 3 places in the world where we actually see gem quality Paraíba come from. So Cuprian tourmaline with these electric blue colors, sometimes going into the green ranges. But you're right, like there is a lot of premium being put on certain sources. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that not all sources are equally understood. Not a lot of the field gemology of understanding the source has been done by the trade. And I think that is because in some places it's easier to do that than others. Because we have to admit that some places are easier to access than others. Some places are just better known than others. For example, a country like Brazil already had a very well and long established culture of gemstones. So the fact that we added Paraíba in the beginning could basically surf on all the recognition that was already present in Brazil. There was a lot of expertise already. Brazil already was known for gemstones. But Mozambique didn't have that yet. So Mozambique at the time of the Paraíba discoveries was, if you asked a gem dealer what Mozambique was, maybe they knew it was a country in southern Africa, but not a lot of people had seen stones from Mozambique 15, 20 years ago when I believe these Paraíba stones started coming out about 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of people were familiar with the country. So that's just a much more difficult, let's call it a marketing to actually brand that. While Brazil had a very strong name within the culture, had a strong base, a lot of supporters, a lot of people from Brazil that want to promote Brazilian stones as Brazil. While Mozambique was lacking that, because there wasn't really a culture yet about Mozambican tourmalines, which is evolving now, and I think there's a lot of appreciation for Mozambican tourmaline, for Mozambican Paraíba stones, like you mentioned, because they do have incredible colors, sometimes with incredible sizes, not always having the clarity, but the sizes of these stones. Like I've seen Mozambican Paraíba cabochon material, but these were over 120 carats, and like these are some of the most phenomenal gemstones I've ever seen. But a lot of people look down on them because they are not Brazilian. But I think that is just because Mozambique hasn't had the time to develop a culture there. And then especially if you look into the third source of Paraíba, Nigerian tourmaline, so Nigerian Paraíba, they're often even not mentioned when we talk about Paraíba. People talk about Brazil, people talk about Mozambique, because Brazil, even though the volume that comes out right now is very, very limited, they basically set the benchmark for Paraíba. And then Mozambique kind of gave its own twist to it with a little bit of a new flavor, a little bit of more color variation, larger sizes, sometimes a little bit lower clarity, but also extremely high clarity stones. But Nigeria never really had the volume to develop its own thing. The Nigerian volume never had enough stones to actually create enough momentum to really make people interested in the source, because either the source was not so important and people tried to sweep it under the rug, or there was just not enough stones to generate interest in it. Nigeria has a lot of perception against it, that it is a very difficult and dangerous country. I've had the most amazing time there when I was there, and of course you have to be careful, but I've been welcomed so warmly by all the Nigerian people I've met, had amazing time there, that I think that a lot of people are scared of it. So we just don't know as much about Nigeria as a gem source, because nobody's really looked into it, and there's been a little bit of, well, very limited interest into exploring Nigeria, but there is no valid reason to not do it. So that's what field gemology is about, that if you work with gemstones that come from Nigeria, try to understand Nigeria a little bit better. Because right now, like if you look into gemstone mining in Nigeria and you want to find information about it, there's almost nothing to be found there. Nothing to be found online or in books or in terms of articles, especially compared to other sources. While Nigeria is probably going to be in the top 5 of gem producing countries when it comes to volume. The amount of quartzes, topazes, beryls, tourmalines that come out of the country are just immense. Also the garnets that come out there, incredible, sapphires. But a lot of people are so unfamiliar with Nigeria as a place that they are not willing to talk about Nigeria as a gem source. So if we start to appreciate Nigeria more as a gem source and get more familiar with it, there is no reason why Nigerian gem sources should be left to the side like they sometimes are right now by the trade, because quality-wise, in terms of the actual gemstones, there is zero argument to do that. The only reason why we're doing it right now is because we don't understand Nigeria as a gem source enough. So that's why it's very important to actually try and understand your gem sources a lot better.
Great. We had a few questions about if it's because of the name, the Paraiba is associated with the location, so all the others are kind of lacking the provenance name. But as we said, it's really because it's time to change the mindset. A lot of things, I think, in our trade. So I think Wim would agree, it's not about the quality, it's just a different color or different sizes. But if you see the results of the auctions recently, the Mozambique Paraiba tourmalines are doing extremely well, tripling prices, really reaching top prices. And they're from Mozambique and they're really desirable as well. So we're not creating a hierarchy of stones. It's just they have different origins, different characteristics as well in the hues and the color spectrum. And there's something for people who love colors, whether they come from Africa or from Brazil.
And I do want to mention that, like, what is considered top material comes from all these places. Like, there are some incredible stones that could rival the finest Brazilian coming out of Mozambique as well. So it's not really only about origin, like where people think that like the quality from Mozambique is different. That's not the case. If we look at ruby, like Vietnam produces some of the most incredible rubies, but people still think of Burma as superior. Like, there is very little argument to still think that. I think a lot of that is, and I think somebody asked that question, where the link to the name, and I think that is something where it is debatable that the trade started associating that name with a certain quality, with a certain, not even quality, with a certain type of material. And for a long time that worked, until we found the same material in another place. So then it became very confusing. Like, do we call this still Paraíba, even though it's not coming from Paraíba, but it is this from Paraíba in Brazil, but it is the same thing that we do see coming out of Paraíba in Brazil. So it gets very confusing there. Like, another theoretical example that someone has brought up to me recently is the gemstone tanzanite. Tanzanite was named after the country of Tanzania. So tanzanite is the name that we give to blue zoisite. Up to this day, we haven't found any tanzanite in other places. But if we do find tanzanite, so blue zoisite, if we start finding it in Australia or we start finding it in Ecuador, are we going to start calling it something else? Or do we still call it tanzanite after the country of Tanzania? So they're very interesting questions, and like, there's no yes or no there, but it's the same thing with Paraíba. Like, should we not call this Paraíba, or should we call this Paraíba because it's the same stone that we did see coming from the Paraíba place first, and we just named it after it? For example, the gemstone where we've actually seen is the gemstone Tsavorite, which is named after the Tsavo area in Kenya. We see Tsavorite coming from a number of places in the world, and there we don't have an issue with it. But for Paraíba tourmaline, a lot of people seem to stumble on it, and I think it's because they don't fully understand or have looked into what it means at the source and really going back to those roots there. And even then, like, it's only if you know that you can actually have that discussion. And a lot of these discussions are never ending. There's no one right or wrong there.
Thank you so much for making that point. That's so important. Guys, if you're joining us now, we're halfway through this live with Wim Vertriest from the GIA, Field Gemology in Bangkok, but today from Carlsbad. And yeah, marketing, it plays a big part. That's also true. We know it in our field, but that's your chance to ask questions. I've seen a few questions. I'm not losing track of them, so I will ask them. There's also, yeah, someone asked if you're familiar, Alexandrite. Are there any new sources of Alexandrite? They're from Russia, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, the original find was in Russia, and that's where the gemstone has been really defined. Because, so again, like, if we go to Alexandrite, again, very interesting if you understand what happened at the source there. Because Alexandrite is The original material that was found, so alexandrite, is a color change variety of chrysoberyl. So chrysoberyl is a very attractive gem mineral in its own right, but we mostly know chrysoberyl from its phenomenal varieties. So we've got cat's eye chrysoberyls, which are very nice and sometimes just referred to as cat's eye, just cat's eyes, but these are actually cat's eye chrysoberyls. But there's also a color change variety. So depending on the chemical compositions and everything, chrysoberyl can have a different color in warm light and cold light, so incandescent and fluorescent lights. So these are the first material where it was really described, this effect, was in Russia at the time when the imperial court was still in charge there. So it was the Tsar Alexander who was ruling at that time. And the imperial colors of the Russian flag back at that time, especially of that specific emperor, that was red and green. So the same stone embodied the Russian imperial colors. So they named that after Tsar Alexander. That's why it is called alexandrite. But right now we still see some alexandrite come out of Russia, out of the traditional area where it was mined deep in the Ural Mountains. But over the last years, we have seen alexandrite deposits being discovered all around the world. I'm going to say that Brazil is probably the second most important one, because Brazil produced some very fine stones with very nice color changes and of really phenomenal sizes. So there are alexandrite sources all around the world. The gem fields related to East Africa will also produce alexandrites, but usually the color changes there are a little bit different. So with these gem fields, I mean the ones that are in Sri Lanka, the gem mines in Sri Lanka, the gem mines in Madagascar, Tanzania. Occasionally people find some alexandrites there as well. But the color changes tend to be a little bit different. They don't have that classic red to green. There's much more often a grayish component or a purplish component in the colors, or even like a yellowish component where it's actually color changing a yellow to a green in the fine stones, sometimes a little bit muddled with some brownish. But also India is an important source, but production is fairly limited there. So I think I'm going to say most of the production there is probably Russian and Brazilian for what we see in fine stones in the market.
Thank you. I hope that helps. I just want to make one clarification. We're only talking about colored gemstones tonight. I know you're on a Rapaport account, so that might be a bit misleading. I'm sorry for all the people asking very specific questions about diamonds. We're really going back to the sources. That's why we haven't covered diamonds at all in this series. So please, I'm just going to do a little announcement for the GIA as well. I saw a few people asking for financial advice. The GIA is a wonderful place to study, and you have a lot of options for scholarships. So please check the GIA website. There are many, many different options if you're very serious about your gemology studies, and the GIA is really offering a lot of different options. So please check. Many times a year you have open calls for scholarships and to help people fund their studies. So it's really trying to be accessible to everyone, as many people as possible, within obviously the reality of the funding, but there are a lot of options. And also I would like to say there is tons and tons of knowledge for free on the GIA website before you even become a student. I mean, if you just learn everything that's out there for free, that's already a lot. So I just wanted to address that because I saw a few people mentioning it in the chat. So yes, yeah, the GIA scholarships are absolutely fantastic. And I think a lot of people are very grateful for the education they receive there. So
all the information you can find there is on GIA's website. So if you Google GIA's website and then search for scholarships, there's a page dedicated to it to see which ones really are available. But I think if we go back to because I think a few days ago we put out a call where we asked people which sources they wanted to know about or which things they wanted to know about. So maybe we can go a little bit into those.
Definitely. And I think we wanted to talk a bit more about, now we talked about the cultural aspect, there's also the geology, there's also the perception, the marketing, the imagination, but there's also something that absolutely when we start learning about colored gemstones, and as I said, this conversation is really about colored gemstones. Diamonds are also gemstones, but we're only talking about colored gemstones here. The political environment in which the gemstones are sourced can have such massive impact. And I think you mentioned Savorite. And I think that's that's a great example we discussed. And I would love our audience to find out a bit more about Savorite, Mozambique, Kenya, Sri Lanka, how everything is connected in history.
So I think it's very interesting times, which I believe it's an ancient saying where it is actually not a nice thing to say to someone that may you live in interesting times, because it means a lot of things changing. And like, yeah, there's a lot of things happening in the world out there, all around the world, that may be very close to us, that may be far away from us. But we have to realize that the gemstone sourcing world is very international. There's a lot of things that could impact things that happen very close to your door, but there's also things that happen very far away that could have an impact through the entire supply chain, and really ripple through where it's really sometimes a butterfly effect where a simple decision somewhere very far away could impact how things on the other side of the world operate. And I think one anecdote that I can bring up to that is, how does a decision in Mozambique, a country that doesn't produce tsavorite, impact the tsavorite manufacturing industry in Sri Lanka, which is an ocean away? So that is something that someone asked me, like, how does it come that Sri Lanka all of a sudden in the last 8 years or so started cutting a lot of tsavorite? Because that wasn't the case until 10 years ago. So in my opinion, I think a lot of it can be explained by decisions made in Mozambique. So not in the tsavorite mining areas, but there used to be a lot of ruby buyers in Mozambique. So they were buying rubies from the artisanal miners there, but a lot of that mining is unlicensed, which means that the government tries to put a stop to it. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure that there is no more market for these stones. Because remember, these people are not mining for all of us to wear beautiful jewelry. They're mining to convert these gemstones into cash that they can use to support their lives. So if the local market for rubies is disrupted there, the people that are buying the international trade, Sri Lankan people, Thai people, West African people, other buyers, if these are not present, there is very little motive, very little incentive for the artisanal to work there. So the Mozambican government actually took some actions and expelled a lot of these people who are not working in Mozambique following the Mozambican rules. They didn't have the right work permits, they didn't pay the right taxes, things like that. So all these people were kicked out. But these Sri Lankan buyers, to a certain degree the Thai buyers as well, they have a very important role to feed their domestic, the Sri Lankan industry. They have a factory of 10, 20, 100, 200 cutters, depending on the supply of gemstones that they send to them. So the fact that they are no longer able to buy Mozambican ruby in Mozambique means that they have to start sourcing gemstones somewhere else. And a lot of these people moved to Kenya, to the city of Voi, where they started sourcing tsavorites and sending these tsavorites to their offices, to their factories in Sri Lanka, and started cutting a lot of tsavorite there. So it's a decision that was made, it's an action made by the Mozambican government that caused all these Sri Lankan gemstone rough buyers to move to Kenya, to start buying tsavorite there, and that really changed what was on offer in the market in Sri Lanka. Around that time, I was actually in Sri Lanka, and I was at a gem show there. And normally, if you go to Sri Lanka, you would expect to see a lot of sapphires, because it's really the blue sapphire islands. But when I walked through that show, half of the booth was just full of tsavorite. And every time I asked someone, they all said, come back tomorrow because I'll have more, because we received a shipment a few days ago and we're cutting it right now, and tomorrow it'll be here at the show. So like the influx of tsavorite into that market, which was, sure, you could find the occasional tsavorite in Sri Lanka like 10, 15 years ago, but that was a rather uncommon thing. While because of that decision of the Mozambican government, a lot of that tsavorite all of a sudden started ending up in Sri Lanka. So if you understand the politics, if you see what the decisions that are being made so close to the source, what kind of ripple effects these could have all throughout the industry, that just gives you so much more insight, so much more interest, so much more flavor to all your gemstones that you're working with.
That's great. And I think that's so interesting because we just don't always link the dots between things, and to be really at the source like you are, It's so important, but also it's really how politics and impacts on economy in a completely different continent. And also, as we said, it saved the livelihood of the Sri Lankan cutters because there's a whole livelihood and community relying on this. So it could have kept the job of 20,000, 30,000. We discussed people. So and we knew how these things go and the dramatic consequences of this on whole communities. So that's really, really interesting. I'm going to take this one. What countries do you recommend sourcing your gemstones from in small parcels? So this talk, Vim, if you want to answer, you can, but I just want to come back for people who just joined us a bit later. This is really about the sources of gemstones as opposed to sourcing gemstones. So I'm sorry if there was confusion earlier, but it's really about where do you source the gemstones.
Yeah, like the places where gemstones come from.
Exactly.
That's really it. And trying to understand that more and trying to understand what happens closer to the source in the supply chain. Because I think if we want to know how jewelry gets made, there's entire libraries dedicated to this. But if we want to know what happens to a gemstone before it was cut, who cut it? Who were the people that valued it? Was it treated? How was it treated? Where was the value add? How does a stone come out of the ground high in the Himalayas or somewhere in the jungles in Brazil? And how does it end up in the international market? There's very little known about that. And that's really what understanding the source is about. That we understand what these gemstones mean for all the people that have worked with it, what the impact of these gemstones is on the local communities, what the gemstones mean for those people, but also how the source impacts the gemstone. And I think we just talked about that with that Mozambican decision that had impact on the tsavorite supply. So these things are very closely connected. But if we understand the source better, we will just understand more what it really means to have these gemstones. And like, for example, I gave the example earlier of if you want to understand, it's not really understanding, it's more if you want to feel what ruby means, talk to some Burmese people. And it's the same thing. Talk to any Colombian person for more than 20 minutes, and emerald will be your favorite gemstone. Because these people have such a passion, such a understanding, such a deep connection with this gemstone, that if you talk to these people, you will really understand what emerald means for them. So it's really about that. Like, what does the source mean for the gemstone, but also what does the gemstone mean for the source? Because there's a lot of these things that if you understand what happens at the source, that you would say, oh, I never thought about this, but it's so interesting about this. If you see decisions being made on certain ways, that you could think, okay, this has an impact on the gemstones. And there's a number of these stories that go around where people have made a decision at the source that might not even be gem related, that actually has an impact on gemstones. So I think another question that somebody asked me is why Thai rubies are not so common anymore. So there's a lot of explanations for it, but I think one of the things that a lot of people don't think about is there's a lot of things that are not associated to the gem trade that actually have a big impact on the Thai ruby trade. So the Thai rubies became a little less popular, first of all, because there was an additional source of gemstones being found. So a lot more rubies were coming out of Myanmar in the early 90s. So that really put a little bit of less stress, less demand on the Thai ruby material. But another thing is the place where the Thai rubies are being mined is also extremely valuable agricultural ground. So a lot of people actually started after they made some money with the rubies and demand was going down a little bit for Thai rubies, they started planting durian trees. So durian is an acquired taste. It is a tropical fruit with a very intriguing smell and a very strong flavor, but it is in very high demand in the East Asian market. So there was a lot of demand for that fruit, and Thailand started planting a lot of these trees, but all these fruit plantations are on top of soil that is actually still full of Thai rubies. So unless the Thai ruby price goes up a lot, or unless the durian price goes down a lot, people will continue growing the durian trees on top of the rubies because there is more money to be made with the durian fruit than there is with the rubies.
Can we just repeat that? Because this is fantastic. This is such a great story. And also we go back to what you mentioned a few times in this talk. It's all about the cash that people are making, because we're talking about livelihood of communities. So if there's more money to be made in farming than using mining rubies, which is such a desirable stones in our conception, we have a lot of fans of durian, so I'm happy we said I wasn't a quartet. We kept it diplomatic. So that's just fantastic, because it goes back to the same thing. It's all about economy, and it's all about what's more important for the local communities. Now we have a whole debate on durian. I love it.
If we look at a little bit of a broader picture and like a broader economic perspective, one thing that is putting some strain on the supply of colored gemstone mining right now is because a lot of the colored gemstone mining, especially in Africa, is still dominated by artisanal mining. A lot of these artisanal miners, like we said, they're not mining so that all of us can wear beautiful ruby jewelry. They are mining because people are giving them cash for the rubies that they mine. But right now, a lot of these people, they see that there is more money to be made with gold because the gold price is so high. And because for gold, it is a very easy thing to sell. Because if you mine gold, you weigh it and you look at the price online and you know how much money you'll make. But gemstones is much more of a gamble, because you could find a stone that is 1 carat and that could be $50,000. But you could also find 20 kilograms of material and it might be worth maybe $20. So when the gold price gets lower, taking that risk of gemstone mining, because gemstone mining is a risk, it's still a little bit of a lottery. You might find that big stone, but you might not find it. When the gold price goes lower, it is more attractive to take that gamble on gemstone mining. So when the gold price drops, there tend to be more people shifting towards mining garnets, mining rubies, mining sapphires. Well, I think now, with the gold price being so high, a lot more people are leaning towards actually mining gold, because there's just so much more money to be made with it. So these are also things that we have to understand at the source, the complications that are happening there, the drivers of the miners, but also what gemstones mean for these people, that we really need to keep that in mind, because that is very important for us to fully understand the picture of all gemstones.
Thank you. That's so important. It's easy to forget that they are commodities at the end of the day. And as you know, that's what this series, we all love the mystique of gemstones and we all love the beauty and the appreciation. But I think, that's what I think this series has been really great with him, that we've really covered the economic importance on the ground for the community. So as I said, if you've missed the first 4 episodes, you can find all of them on our Instagram account in the Reel section, on the YouTube channel at Rapaport Jewelry Pro. And we have a few questions that popped up. I saw a few questions on Colombian emeralds. They're still held in high demand compared to other locations. I think it's like Paraíba, tourmalines from Brazil. There's still a big mystique attached to it, especially with the historical stones coming up at auctions.
I think when it comes to Colombian emeralds, I think it's also a very interesting story there, because if we go back to the source, Colombian emeralds carry a premium, not necessarily because they're better emeralds. Colombian emeralds carry a premium because they've got a longer story. Of course, the stones are incredible. It is not only about the story, but if we have 2 almost exactly the same stones from different places, there is usually still a premium for Colombian stones. But that is because Colombia has a 500-year head start compared to Zambia, for example, or compared to the Afghan emeralds. And that has given them 500 more years to develop that whole culture around it, to develop that whole aura of it, to make sure that they are included. They've just had more opportunity, basically, because they've been around for a lot longer. That doesn't mean that they're nicer. That doesn't mean that they're better. It just means that they have more recognized appreciation in the jewelry industry. And I really want to emphasize it's recognized appreciation in the industry. Because if you go to a number of the finest ruby dealers in the world and you ask them where the finest rubies come from, I don't think a lot of them will actually say Burma. While a lot of people do think that Burmese rubies are superior, a lot of ruby dealers will actually say, like, no, Tanzanian rubies were actually some of the objectively nicest stones. But that doesn't mean anything, because this whole industry is very emotion driven, very intuitive, very instinct driven, where objectivity, sure, it says one thing, but it's not all it. It is not, if you put two stones next to each other, there is always one you're going to like better. And it doesn't matter which one it is, because it doesn't mean that the stone is better. It really means like, it's really for you to say, I like this one better. And that doesn't mean that the other stone is worse. It just speaks more to you. Maybe you like it better because it has a different origin. Maybe you prefer a Zambian emerald over a Colombian because you've once been on safari in Zambia. Maybe you like Colombian emeralds better because you met a really nice man who made the most amazing empanadas for you, and he was from Colombia. Doesn't matter at all. What matters is, like, what do you like best? And if you think origin is really important, that's really good. If you don't care about origin at all, that is also really good. As a closing thing, like, I want to say that for field gemology, it is trying to understand more of what is around your stone. Because I think we all understand, like, a gemstone is really special, but it is more than just a pretty shiny rock. There is a whole story around it. And I think field gemology is trying to understand that story better. The place where it comes from, the people that worked with it, the journey that stone has taken from the mine all the way to the jewelry, the actual amazing things about the material itself, the gem itself, the process that formed, that created that material into the earth, the processes, the techniques that were used to extract it, that how humans took it out of the ground and brought it to the light. That is what field gemology is about. Field gemology is not about looking at the tree. Field gemology is not about looking at the gemstone or the tree. Field gemology is trying to see the whole forest around it, because that is what makes it really special. So I think we got that across over the last 5 sessions, that there is a lot more to your gemstone than the actual shiny, sparkly rock. And it's really to us to explore more about it, because it will just teach us a lot more about our gemstones.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, William. I love the analogy of the forest.
Yeah.
That's what we've been doing these 5 sessions. I'm going to wrap it up. I think someone asked about time, Jake. I think I saw an account. Thank you for the earlier question as well. I'm okay. It's just a bit of, sorry for the loud background here. Talking about origin. So I would like to say, are people going to be more interested in the retail space about the origin of color gemstones? I think that's really about sharing the stories, showing as much as possible. When retailers get more knowledge, they pass it on to the clients and the customers, and everyone benefits from it. So some of us are very lucky because we had time with Wim, so we've learned a lot about the sources of gems and everything that has to do with field gemology. But I think that's really the future. Are people going to see you in Tucson?
Yes, I think I'm like 95% confirmed to go to Tucson, where I think most of what we do in Tucson is going to be a little bit more technically inclined. So it's going to be more towards the technical side of gemology, where I think at GIA we will have a number of seminars that we will be hosting in Tucson. Some of them will be free at the booth, where we will have some short discussions on heat treatment of stones, how to identify that, maybe synthetic rubies versus natural rubies. We're kind of making that up. And I believe that we will do a larger seminar that you will have to register for, which will probably be very focused on practical origin determination, using the microscope to do origin determination. I believe that after next week, because next week is going to be a big break here in the USA, after next week, they will probably start putting a lot more of that information about what GIA is planning at the AGTA Tucson show. That will become available online. There will be program schedules. And I think if there are things that you have to sign up for, that will also be at the website available there.
Fantastic. So I would like to really thank the GIA Gemological Institute of America for sponsoring this series, for lending us Wim Vertriest for 5 episodes, catching you in between your trips around the world, exploring gemstones, telling us so much that I think has benefited us, all of us, to see things a bit differently and try to see the fuller picture as well. So I can't encourage you more to go on the GIA website, try to learn as much as possible. And if you, before even becoming a student, I really encourage you. And of course, I encourage you to watch the previous 4 episodes if you missed them, YouTube channel, Real section in Instagram. And I'm very sad because that's our last episode with Wim, but I hope we'll speak to you very, very soon.
All right, thank you so much. And that was amazing. And thank you also for sending all the questions in advance and during the talk. That really helped us talk about the things that you wanted to learn about when we were talking about field gemology.
Thank you so much to everyone. And please, if you have more questions for Wim, for the GIA, for Rapaport, please send us DMs. We're always happy to hear from you, especially if you ask questions specific about diamonds that we haven't covered tonight because that wasn't the theme. Yes, please go on the GIA social pages. You'll learn about campuses, online studies, and all the options you have to further your gemology knowledge or to start your career in gemology. So I really encourage you to do it. And thank you so much, Wim, for your time. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much.